Audio's okay. Audio's on. So we're going live to 2 people and a dog. Okay, my name is Dave. I just want to give you a quick run through. I know some of you have just come in there. So I'm just trying to get names if I can. And I know I've got Tom, I've got Robin, I've got Dee, I've got Madeline, Deborah, Sandy. Catherine. That's my ex-wife's name. Oh dear. I will not forget that name. Catherine. Marilyn. Pam. Joe. June. Okay. Now, there's no way I'm going to remember the back row. Okay, 1. So I will ask your name again because I think that's important. I want to kind of connect with you personally. So what we're doing here is we're giving you a course. This is a creative photography course which assumes no prior knowledge. I did get the phones to silent a bit for everybody, didn't I? I want to be sure, because one of those goes off midstream. It's like, oh my gosh. So I'm assuming no prior knowledge, but I do need to get you into modes in the camera that allow you to get some of these effects. Okay? So I will be asking you to look at your camera, keep your camera with you, try not to keep turning it on and off if you can, take the lens caps off. So anything which gets in your way, just keep that ready to go, okay? And then as I will try to translate, because a camera is a camera, but something that Nikon call it, I may say Nikon. That's the right way to say it, by the way. Okay. I had a Japanese student, and I asked her, and she said Nikon. Sorry. No argument. No argument. So I will translate that for everybody. The cameras are different, and I'm familiar with some of the cameras, but not all. So the default line is always try to find the PDF of the manual that you've got. Do a search, your camera brand, your camera model number, PDF, user manual, and it'll come down. And then you can save it on your phone, you can save it on your laptop, and that's all extremely helpful. Okay, guys, so we're kind of going live right now. Correctamundo? See, oh, everything goes silent behind there now. No more chit-chat. Dave is being told, press start button to activate shooting. Okay, we will need to make sure that we've got camera 1 turned on and off. Mike, I don't know if Mike is hearing me. I'm seeing nothing on camera 1 right now. Wasn't there a movie where somebody announced that he was going to commit suicide live on air? I'm kind of feeling that way at the moment. We're having technical issues. Okay, now we're good. Right, okay, welcome everybody. So, my name is Dave McKane, and I run the Institute of Photography. And essentially what we've done is we've teamed up with I was going to say Kiowa, but I'm told it's Kiowa. Is that right? So the Kiowa County Media Center. And the great people here and I have been working together for the last 2 months. And we've been moving towards getting this as a live stream course. Now, what we're trying to do is something that I don't think has been done either very well or at all. So really what we're trying to do here is we're trying to give a wide classroom-based course, because one of the main things about online training is that how does that translate to your camera? Now, we can't do that for 5 billion people, of course, but the classroom allows those questions. Well, my camera doesn't really do that kind of thing. Or how would I deal with this particular issue? So it allows me to translate that, and the audience that's through these cameras will be hearing that as well. So I will need the classroom audience to ask those questions. So by all means, shout out, if your camera doesn't have something. I have a mantra that I use every single time I teach. There is no such thing as a stupid answer. By the way, we say stupid, you say stupid. I sometimes do it. I translate on the fly. I speak fluent American, by the way. I don't always. So there is no such thing as a stupid question. If you don't know it, you don't know it. Okay, that's it. And I'm here to be able to translate that for you and say whether maybe your camera has it or it doesn't. So the team here are quite unique. We were born with all this information. We didn't have to learn a single thing that we know. It was quite amazing. It was a rare occurrence, wasn't it, Grant? Yeah, it was a rare occurrence. Yeah. No, we picked it up. We failed. And one of the big problems with, I think, particularly with Western society, we have a fear of failure. It's only when you fail do you learn. And if you fail big time, you learn big time. So you don't do that thing ever again. So we need you to ask those questions. So by all means, please do so. Okay? All right. So I'm going to go and can we? Yes, we can get that. That's fantastic. Right. So we're basically switching. We had a bodge during the week where we want you to see what's going on here to a degree. But apparently, if I do this, Can we just throw up camera 4 if you can. I don't know if you can. You don't have a feed, right? So camera 4 is this room. If camera 4 sees camera 4, you get an infinity loop. Go as if you could walk in. So Grant was particularly concerned about that, so we were working through that. Anyway, you don't care about that. You just care about photography. So what are the important camera settings that you would use? Mike, I'm not getting... Control-Alt-Delete. All right. Where's the suicide watch? What's the phone number? Have you got a hotline? I need to call that immediately. All right. So what are the important camera settings? We're going to get that up there. It's going to come up in a sec. To a huge degree, photography is based around the best camera for any given situation. The best camera for any given situation is the one you have with you. So phones are in huge use nowadays. They far exceed SLRs. They far exceed kind of high-end camera usage by a big degree. So what we're looking to do is we're looking to make sure that you can make best use of the camera that you've got. Camera shake is the biggest issue that you have. Now, I used to joke that in Kansas that was never an issue because it's all to do with the availability of light. Well, this morning, camera shake would be a big issue. So what we're looking to do with any camera we hold is to understand that when the light level drops, camera shake becomes a distinct possibility. So what is camera shake? Camera shake basically is the fact that you're alive. Your body is moving all the time. And when it's moving, the camera can record that movement if the shutter speed is too slow. Low light forces the camera to use a slow shutter speed. So that's why at home, indoors, at night, your shots are more likely to be blurry, particularly if the flash hasn't fired. Is that okay? Oh my gosh. Right, I'm not going to make the suicide call now. But we can also bring in some techniques that will minimize that. So for example, we have to stop using the inbuilt zoom that every person has from the day they were born. And this is the inbuilt zoom. And the out zoom is even worse. Back home in Dublin, I actually did see a young woman in 6-inch high stilettos on a cobble street using the inbuilt zoom out. And I don't know how she stayed upright. So the further away from the center of gravity that you are, the more you're swinging in the wind. So that's why, for example, live view cameras, and some cameras can only give you a live view. If they have a viewfinder, that's great. But if you're like a phone, if you're looking through the LCD, the further away that camera goes from you, the more checking. So the problem is that you're alive. If you're dead and rigor mortis has set in, that's a particularly good stable platform. Okay, so you don't need a tripod, nothing's moving there at all. So here's the technique, particularly with SLRs, but with any camera at all. You've got to have a straight line through your body. Take that camera and bring it as close as possible, or best of all, right up to your eye. Number one. The camera shake issue is any movement at all, including if you whack the camera. So touching the shutter button, I'm exaggerating to make a point, now you have it. So if you have a look at all of your cameras, even point and shoots, bridge cameras, you'll see that the camera shutter button itself has a kind of a raised collar area around it. Can you see that? That raised camera area is actually allowing you to get a half press on the shutter button. The half press is what locks focus and prepares the camera for the shot. It actually also speeds up the shooting in any situation where you're waiting for somebody to look up, bang, I got them. Because the first press is the focus. That's what slows everything down on the camera. It might only be slowing it down for a millisecond, but it's still slowing it down. So basically, I can focus, I can recompose if I want, and then on the count of 3, I'm going to take this shot. 1, 2, 3. Hardly any movement in my finger. There was no movement. It was simply a flexing of the pad at the tip of my finger. So that last bit means that there is minimal movement. I have to keep using the word minimal because I'm alive. There is movement. Last but not least, we want to talk about stabilization, image stabilization, vibration reduction. I'm sure you may have this saying here, I don't know, but we have a saying back home that says, it's the best thing since sliced bread. So cameras, where they have them, Nikons, Canons will have them in the lens. Micro Four Third cameras like the Olympus will have them in the body, where something is vibrating, something is moving. And the tech people here will drag me out and shoot me for this, but essentially what the image stabilization, vibration reduction super steady shot is trying to do is that as you fall, it's trying to rise. As you rise, it's trying to fall. So it's trying to cancel out that movement. So making sure that that's on when you are handheld with a shot is vital, because that allows you to take shots in lower light without the use of flash, while still, again not guaranteeing, while still hoping and maybe getting a sharper shot. Does that make sense? So watch for that. Now, by the way, when I do talk about this, it is important to know that if the camera is on something steady, and I don't mean your husband, because he may not be, tripod, on a wall, on top of a car, you would turn that anti-shake off, because that vibration is coming back into the camera body. It doesn't give you blur, but it takes away sharpness. And we want sharpness when we want it in every shot when we want it. So image stabilization, vibration reduction, anti-shake, off on a steady surface, on when you have a tripod. Does that make sense? And in fact, the shutter speeds that are capable, that you can get away with, are quite astonishing. And I have them up here on screen. And let me just now go to the computer so people can see. So if you've got a standard kit lens and you're at something around 55 millimeters, you might actually need something like 1/100th of a second. But you could actually shoot as slow as 1/6 of a second. And let me give you the sound of that. So 1/100th of a second sounds like this. Now this is an SLR, so it has a mirror, and that mirror has to kick up out of the way before the shot's taken. So the sound you're hearing is that mirror. So you're hearing it just one sound. Let me go back down now to the kind of shutter speed that we could theoretically shoot when we have image stabilization with that 55 millimeters. That was 2 shots. Do you hear the gap between the two? So the gap between the two is the sound of blurred photos. Let me give you a 1 second shutter speed here. So in a church, blurred shot. Okay, so we're trying to make sure that we get that shutter speed as fast as we possibly can, and I will talk a little bit now about that and about how we do that. Okay, so we have various ways to increase the light. Fast shutter speeds at the best quality are dependent on the amount of light that you have. So bright sunny days are going to give you that light. As the light level drops, then the exposure, what the camera is measuring, in fact, is what we call an exposure value. It says there is an amount of light in that space that you're pointing at. And I will divide that through what we call the exposure triangle. And the exposure triangle is basically light coming in through the shutter, through time, light coming in through the aperture, through volume, and light coming in through the ISO, which is essentially an increase in sensitivity. Now, audio engineers refer to a hiss. You've all heard this hiss. You've got particularly a cheap hi-fi system, no music playing, you turn the volume up. You hear that hiss? You know the one I'm talking about? You hear some feedback? Engineers call that white noise. Essentially, with the sensors on digital cameras, when you ramp up the ISO, you're ramping up the volume. And as the volume goes up, you get noise. And the noise you get is visible noise. And that visible noise looks like this. So the visible noise is full of black speckles and color speckles. We've two kinds. There's luminance, which is the black, and color, which is the little pink, purple, green, blue speckles that can come in. So we have a problem. In low light, when there's no more light for us to get, we cannot switch any lights on, we cannot make the sun be brighter than it is, we have to find ways of gathering extra light. The default and high quality way to do that is to get the light through your lens. But in low light, quite often the first thing that happens in P mode is the camera will max out your aperture. It will give you the smallest aperture number, which actually is the physically biggest aperture itself. So for many people, they begin to realize that when they use the kit lens that came with their camera by default, that when they go to zoom in a little bit, they find that the aperture number is 5.6. Now that means nothing to most people very early on. It's just another string of numbers that are coming at you from this camera. Digital has brought with it a lot of control, and with control becomes responsibility. Manual film cameras are very simple. They had about 2 buttons. You went from a Pentax to an Olympus, there were 2 buttons. Maybe 3 if you had a high-end camera. So now we have all these buttons that are giving us direct access to things that we are responsible for, and we've no idea of what they're actually doing. Until we do. And practice and practice and practice does that. So the first lens that many people go for is a lens called a 50mm 1.8. Depending on the brand, that may be a super cheap lens or it may not. In my experience, Canons and Nikons, because they are so ubiquitous, there are so many of them, you can pick up a 50mm 1.8 lens in the region of $100 or less. The Sonys, the Olympus, because the numbers aren't there, I'm guessing, they tend to be that bit more expensive. But nonetheless, the theory remains the same. A 5.6 aperture is a hole that size, and a 1.8 aperture is a hole that size. The bigger the hole, the more light coming in. The more light coming in through the bigger hole, the faster the shutter speed can go. So primarily, the reason why people are going for one of these lenses is that indoors at night, they can take handheld shots where the shutter speed and ISO combination is not so bad. Photography is full of compromises. Every scene you approach, every single scene you approach is a combination of what do I want and what am I prepared to let go of to make that happen. In this case, we have a situation where I've had to let go of quality. And the quality here is in terms of the noise. I mentioned that when we approach any scene, we're trying to identify what the important thing is. And nearly always, there's one thing that is the most important. In general, where there is movement, the shutter speed is the key. Where there is depth, and we'll talk about that in our landscape section, where there's depth to your shot, then you are talking about the aperture being key. We can't separate any of these exposure triangles. We need shutters, we need apertures, and we need ISO. Every single one of them have to be there. We cannot remove any one. But how they are used. And as I say, the first thought is, what's the most important thing? Right now, no matter how many episodes of CSI Las Vegas you watch, it is not possible to unblur a blurred shot. You do not want to be in the room when I'm watching that show. I've seen things like, we're in Nevada, yes, focus on that number plate in California. Resolve, oh look, they're disabled. No! Not possible. Not possible. Well beyond the limits of technology at the moment. Our grandkids, who knows? But right now. So when these guys who are doing Irish football, when they're playing and running, if they're blurred, they stay blurred forever. I can't make them sharp ever again. Only there, only then, with the settings I choose, do I have that chance. So to get my shutter speeds up, I increase the ISO. And essentially, ISO turns up just in the same way that shutter speeds, aperture, they are measured in stops. Essentially, and this is not, I'm not going to go into this in any depth at all here, but just to throw it out. Essentially, when we bring the exposure triangle in, the camera has measured the light, and let's say it measures an exposure value of 10. That means that if your shutter is 1, then and your aperture is 4, your ISO is 5. 1 plus 4 plus 5 equals 10. If I want my shutter to go to 4, then one of the other two or both have to adjust to make sure the answer is 10. So if I want 4 on the shutter, then I need to drop the aperture back to 2, that's 6, and then the ISO goes to 4. That's essentially what's going on. Now I can make that, say in manual mode, give an answer of 11. That will be an overexposed shot, too much light. I can make it give me an answer of 9. That will be an underexposed shot. So I can still do that if I want. But the goal by and large in photography is to get a sharp shot that's correctly exposed. The modes, particularly the auto modes and particularly P modes, are trying to make sure you do that. My goal is to get to people to understand that in those modes the camera is trying to save you from yourself. You may not know what it's doing, and I'm sure we've all done this in our heads anyway. You go take a photograph. Let me just see. I don't want one check number shutter speed. And in your head you're going, ooh, that's nice. I don't know what I did. But the thing to bear in mind here is that any photo that I take, any photo at all, has numbers on the back. And if I play back this shot, I just took a black shot here. I have a whole series of numbers which are recorded at the time the shot was taken. So shutter, aperture, ISO, lens, focal length, what metering mode were you using? What did you have for breakfast that morning? No, sorry, that's the upgrade. Pay the extra for that. So we have those recordings. And in fact, many image editing software, I'm thinking of kind of software like Lightroom, Photoshop, Elements, they all have an ability in some way to show you the information, the Exif data. The Exif data is the camera settings at the time the shot was taken. So here, for example, 0.4 of a second at f8 at ISO 640 on a 20mm lens. So I can see that. That's just a compressed amount of data. So I can see all that, which means that at some point I can play back the shot and see the settings. So for example here, I'll show you this later. This shot here is showing depth of field. F4, F14. What's the difference between those two? So I have that information that I can play back at a later stage if I wish. So when movement is occurring in our shots, it's the shutter speed that matters most. If we want to freeze that action, and by and large, cameras are trying to freeze action. There are a number of kind of defaults set into the camera. They're assuming that you want to photograph and focus on the biggest, nearest thing. That's usually correct. They're assuming that you want the shutter speed to be fast enough to minimize camera shake. That's a fair assumption. So in auto particularly, the camera is doing these things. And so you may get an effect, but the effect was an accident of the settings because they're trying to do something else. So the camera is always trying to give us fast shutter speeds. And by extension, it's trying to stop us getting slow shutter speeds. So I'm going to show you a quick way, depending on your own use of it. If you've got an SLR, if you've got a camera that has P mode that allows you to change the shutter speeds, and I'll show you how to do that. If I go to P mode on this camera here, I can utilize a thing called program shift. So if you look here at these numbers, it's saying 1/50th of a second at f5.6. So everything about this camera is trying to give me a small f number. Let me explain f numbers first of all. Of the three things in photography that have to do with exposure, shutter, ISO, and aperture. Aperture requires a rocket degree license to understand what the heck is going on, because the numbers don't directly connect. A big aperture number is a physically small aperture, which gives you a big depth of field. A small aperture number is a physically big aperture. A small aperture number is a physically big aperture. So it's in the opposite. Small number, big hole. Big number, small hole. And then the depth of field that they control. So essentially what I say to people starting out. By the way, can I just go on a little sidebar here? There is a lot of educational theory around how long it takes you to master, to control, to really be at the cutting edge of something. Do you know how long that is? 10,000 hours. If you've got a 40-hour week, you're doing 2,000 hours a year. Photography seems to come with it this disconnect with reality. If somebody put a grand piano in your front room, they just gave you a present of it. Every single person who visits your house will say this, and they'll use this tone. Can you play that? The assumption is that you don't know how to do it because playing a piano is complicated. You put a black camera in somebody's hand, they've only just bought it yesterday in the store, and the next day they get an invitation to take a photograph at a wedding. Or all the photographs. Sure, you have a camera. Digital is what's allowed that. Back in the day, with film cameras, you knew you needed a lot of information to make that thing work. So digital has fooled us into thinking that we don't need to know as much. And I'm telling you, you still need to know a lot. But the modes will help you with some of that heavy lifting. So that's what P mode is about. So essentially what I can do is if I change the F number, I can control the amount of light coming in. So by going to P mode and moving the dial, depending on your camera, you may have a front dial and a back dial, or a single dial somewhere. It may be just behind the shutter button, which is the tendency with Canons. It may be on the back, which is the tendency with Nikons. So as I move that dial, I get a change in the F number. The F number at f29 is now giving me a slower shutter speed. So here's a very simple thing. You need to be fairly quick with this. The camera will allow you change the F number, and with a small F number, what you're looking at doing is dropping the light coming in. When you drop the light coming in, the shutter speed has to increase, has to go longer. P mode quite often goes back to being normal. So on Canons you have a few seconds just to get that shot before it goes to sleep, and then when it comes back, it goes back to its default. Nikons, when you utilize that, there's a little asterisk, a little star that comes up beside the word P. And I'm not sure, but I'm absolutely sure the other camera manufacturers have very similar ways of dealing with that as well. So the safety net is that it goes back to being the setting that brings in more light to get the faster shutter speeds to stop camera shake. Does that make sense? So with the F number itself, if we just disconnect, see back in the day, lenses were such that as you changed the aperture, you could see the physical change. the entry-level Nikons have a little graphic representation as you change the aperture. So that's kind of handy. But now we have to guess. We have to project into this bit of thing, plastic or metal or whatever, what's happening to the aperture. We don't know. So my simple tip is, look at the F number and translate that into what you want. So a big F number gives you a big depth of field. I will talk about that later. A small F number gives you a small depth of field. So we're equating small with small. But a big F number drops the light coming into the camera. A small F number increases the light coming into the camera. With more light, faster shutter speeds. With less light, slower shutter speeds. We're still trying to make sure we get a correct exposure. I mean, that's hugely important in this, that we can get a shot that's not too bright and not too dark. That is the absolute main goal of every shot you take, unless you don't want to. We actually live in a Western liberal democracy. If you like dark shots, you're paying for it. You can have it. But in general, we're looking for sharp shots that are correctly exposed. And then there is an old adage, but if you want to break the rules, you need to know them first. So you can certainly do that. So I'm going to kick over here now to just an indicator of what those shutter speeds do as you start going with a bigger F number. This is a combination, in fact. It's a very dull day. That was the little stream out the back this morning, just as I was coming into the ancient monument created by the Vikings all those hundreds of years ago is off in the distance. So I've set the exposure triangle to give me what I want. These are tutorial shots, so I'm not concerned about the noise. You see that the ISO here is actually showing 1000 ISO. The F number is 2.8. That's a big aperture. It's a physically big hole letting lots of light in. On that dull early morning in Glendalough in Ireland, I'm getting 1/500 of a second with those settings. So what I now do is I start changing the aperture number. You don't see me changing that, but I'm telling you the number is going to change, and I'm only changing the number. I'm in aperture priority mode, which is AV on Canons, and I think on Pentax, and it's A on other cameras. So essentially what I'm saying is that if we control the aperture size, the hole, then what we can do is we can control the shutter. There is lots of, if you went to a camera club, you would say, oh yes, but. And I would say, okay. Because I'm trying to figure out what's the most important thing I want. So in this shot, can we get camera? There we go. Thank you, Mike. So, for example, here's f4, f5.6. So I'm changing the apertures until I run out of apertures, and then I change the ISO. Okay? So essentially what you're going to see is very little difference. 1/500 of a second is the shutter speed. 1/250th of a second. 125th. 1/60th. 1/30th. The cameras by default are trying to give us the fastest shutter speed it possibly can to minimize camera shake. Those shutter speeds rarely blur the things that we see on a regular basis. Water, people moving under normal pressure, waves, fountains. The magic number for a lot of these, in fact, is 1/15th of a second. 1/15th of a second is a transition number. And what I want you to watch for here is the effect of the shutter speed. This is all in camera. This is not stuff you can create in Photoshop without being an illustrator and drawing it from scratch. 1/15th of a second now, which I get because I go to f16. Now I'm beginning to see something magical. Now what I'm seeing is I'm seeing the effect of each of these droplets of water being allowed to travel through the shot. And in fact, a theory I'm going to talk to you about in a second is that once you've frozen water, once you've frozen movement, you don't need a faster shutter speed because you've already frozen it. But as you decrease the shutter speed, then you exaggerate the effect of that movement. This is half a second, 1 second, 2.5 seconds. So this is not ever an attempt to tell you which one of these is best. So in a photography competition is designed to find the best photo. Which photo wins the competition? Is it the best photo, do you think? Have you ever looked at a competition saying, I'm not really crazy about that shot? Oh, look at the runner-up, I like that one better. So in actual fact, the best shot never wins. The best shot that the judge thought was the best shot is what wins. They're two different things. We have to separate that. What we're doing here, remember the Western liberal democracy I referred to. This is a creative output. And when there is no financial reward on the other end, if the amount of food you can put on your table does not matter based on the shot you take, then go take the shot you want. And it doesn't matter what that is. This series of images, in fact, has always resulted in interesting conversations. But the conversations are usually this from my students. That's the best one. Oh no, that's the best one. Oh no, that's the best one. What do they really mean? That's the one I like best. That's the one I like best. That's the one I like best. And you know what? You're allowed to. Because it's a creative endeavor. So we also in ourselves, I believe, have to separate what we think as best and correctly title it what I think is best. And by the way, what you think is best will change over time. Have you ever looked back in your archive, photographs that you were really, really pleased with, and then you go, how did I ever think that shot was good in the first place? Because the other thing about the creative endeavor is that we're getting better as we go along. We're learning new things. So let me now just show you the understanding of how that works and what I'm doing to apply it. So in this particular shot, the camera has given me a shutter speed of 1/1250th of a second. That has frozen the water. 1/200th of a second, I'm seeing a little bit of movement here. So they're crashing waves. I'm waiting to shoot only when the waves have started to come down on those rocks. What if I get down to below or in around that magic number of 1/15th of a second? 1/10th of a second. This shot was taken quite literally without a tripod, but with the knowledge of everything I've talked to you about. So I found a rock, I put my foot on the rock, I'm resting my elbow on my knee, I have a straight line down to the earth. And then as those waves crash, I am gently pressing the shutter button. So I get the shot I want. But I also know that around 1/10th of a second is at the limit of what a human being can hold. Most people. I have friends who can hold cameras dead steady at about half a second. And I think they temporarily die. Just in that moment. And then they're fine after that. I don't know how they do it. So really what we're trying to do is, again, to understand the technical side. So creative photography, in actual fact, and photography as a whole, is a really strange mix of the creative and the technical. And that's what's challenging about it. So early on, we rely on auto. But auto is trying to focus on the biggest, nearest thing. It's trying to make sure the shutter speed is high enough to prevent camera shake. It's doing other things as well. But primarily, that's a huge part of what it's trying to do. And then we go off the cliff. We hit something, and the result is, woo, I'm getting back. And you run back to auto and say, I always loved you. I'm sorry you feel so upset. So we have a period, and like any learning process, we know, in fact, we go through what psychologists refer to as the conscious incompetence. So we start off with consciously incompetent, knowing we know nothing. But eventually, we get to unconscious competence, where over time, over 10,000 hours, and it's not 9,999, you know nothing, and then 1 hour later you do. There's a process. And then you get to where you just know it without worrying about it. So when you all first started driving, you're worried about, particularly the young kids now, they're worried about, did that text come in properly? The truck coming at you is going to kill you, but is that text coming in properly? No. You're driving and you're distracted driving, and you're too busy figuring out, and then, oh, there's somebody behind me, I didn't see them. And then you get to a point where you're just coasting along. You're quickly glancing at all the rear view mirrors, you're keeping an eye out front, particularly now for deer. And for the first time ever in my life, 2 weeks ago, gorgeous rising sun as I'm heading past Huron, and a coyote comes out in front. He looks at me, more or less says, "What are you doing here?" and just continues across the highway. Anyway, so we're now able to keep all that in our head because all the other stuff is unconsciously competent in our brain. So taking photos. The big problem is that we think the proximity to our camera, in a camera bag, in a wardrobe, will do. And it doesn't. I'm still quite amazed myself that even now, after all these years, when I start setting in the calendar, I'm going to go out on Saturday to take some photos. Almost immediately I'm thinking, the lawn needs to be done. Can I really afford to go out and take a photograph? Or that night, I may want an extra little glass of wine. What if I'm too tired? So immediately I'm factoring in reasons why I shouldn't go out and do what I do. The reason why professionals are so good at what they do is they've no choice. I was talking to a professional a few years ago, a professional photographer. He's so fed up with Uncle Johnny. Because apparently any shot he takes, somebody's Uncle Johnny can do as good a shot. And he says, Uncle Johnny only needs to do one of those a year. I have to do one every hour. And that's the difference. So the experience, that's essentially what we're trying to do. So movement, getting the shutter speed down, is blurred by a slow shutter speed. We need to make sure that everything's dead steady. That's why tripods are so important. And people don't like tripods. But without them, you won't get what you want. So the pre-focusing thing that I talked about earlier on, I said that the shutter button on the camera is trying to help us because there's a two-part sequence. The first press, the half press, is the one that reads the exposure, measures the light, and also locks focus. So what I'm looking to do is to make sure that what I want in focus is in focus. My primary goal as a photographer is to make sure that what I want in focus is in focus. The primary goal of the camera, when all focus points are set, and that's what happens now, we have multiple focus points. And they're like a bat. They're like a bat reaching out in the night for the tree. In the case of the bat, it's trying to make sure it doesn't hit the tree. Our autofocusing is trying to make sure we lock on, focus on the tree. So the biggest nearest thing will be what the camera wants, each and every single time. So what we need to do is to train ourselves to not rely, unless you're a sports photographer where things are moving so fast, unless you're a wildlife photographer, birds moving around very fast, you're going to benefit from all those focus points. But if you're ambling around, if you're walking around, if you are on a tripod taking a landscape, there's nothing moving. Now, I suppose the bison coming towards you may cause you some trouble eventually, but essentially nothing is moving. So we can afford to turn off all those focus points and just leave one if we're using autofocus. Each camera has its own way of doing that, and that's where the manual comes in. So what I would recommend would be that you find out how you do that. So on the Canon system, I have an AF, autofocus point selection system. So in this particular camera, I have 9 focus points. Each one of those reaching out to try and guess what I want to focus on. And if they're currently in operation, I would ask you to do this. Put the camera up to your eye and gently press the shutter button as you move around the room. No need to take a photo. And as you move around the room, what you'll see as you let go of the shutter button, touch it again, let go of the shutter button, touch it again, you'll see that different focus points are lighting up. Is that right? That's if you've got all focus points on. Well, it's saying, aha, that's the nearest thing. No, that's the nearest thing. So it's constantly reaching out to figure out what you want. Because again, it's trying to save you from yourself. If we go and turn it, and for handheld photography, the recommendation is the center focus point. So however I can choose it, move around with a dial on the back, with a controller at the back, with a dial on the front, whatever. If I can move it to where I simply have one focus point in operation, that allows me to make sure that the guy in the top hat, thanks Mike, that the guy in the top hat is in focus. Now the default setting will make sure that happens anyway, but I want to make sure he's in focus. If I focus on the guy behind, then the general autofocus system with all focus points on will not let that happen, because he's the biggest, nearest thing. Does that make sense? So when we have the center focus point in operation, what we're allowed to do very easily now is point at the important thing. Now here's another process. What is the important thing? I'll talk a little bit later with in relation to composition. The most important thing is usually in the dead center of our photos. We've just put them there by default. We haven't thought about it. So look for that. That's probably the most important thing. Focus on it, and then move the camera so that they go to the left or the right, to the top or the bottom. Again, I will touch on that much, much more when we do composition. So essentially I can focus on Robin, finger halfway down, recompose the shot, which simply means I move the camera, so I place the elements in the frame the way I want. And if I don't move closer or further away, because what I've done is I focused on Robin, well, actually, in fact, it's a misnomer. I focus on the current distance between me and Robin. So I can't lock focus and then move back here and have any expectation the shot will be in focus. But I can go there, because primarily the distance hasn't changed. Now, if we have a big aperture of f1.4, I'll show you now how shallow the depth of field can be on that. I may have some issues simply pointing up and down. But by and large, with normal kit lenses, you should not have a problem. So that's how I can, going to go to computer mic, thank you. That's how I can make sure that he's in focus, because I will point at him. So now I can focus through the biggest nearest thing, past the biggest nearest thing. I'm allowed now to decide and lock on to the thing that I decide is important. Now, if he's in focus or out of focus, I may not be terribly bothered about. But I am concerned that he's in focus. That's the thing I cannot let go of, because that's what I want, if that's the decision that I've made within that shot. Does that make sense? Okay. So let me show you, we talk about numbers. So we talk about a 50mm 1.8. You know, this is kind of shorthand for 50mm f1.8, much too long. So we tend to drop it just to a 50mm 1.8 is what we mean. So in this particular shot here, it's a 1.4 lens. In fact, let me just bring the audience to the computer so they can see that as well. So it's a 1.4 lens, and it's pin sharp. Her eye is pin sharp. Depth of field becomes smaller. The depth that's in focus decreases, becomes smaller as the aperture number gets smaller. The aperture number gets smaller. With me focused on the right eye at f1.4, the amount of distance between those two eyes is fractions of an inch. I'm going to use a strange language here. It's about 3 millimeters. Across the pond, we use a different method altogether. So it's fraction. I mean, if it's 1/32 of an inch, if it's 1/62, it's certainly a fraction of an inch. So when I move the camera, I have to be mindful if I have those aperture numbers. I may have to find another way. And in fact, that other way, going to camera 2, Mike, might be that when I'm locked down on a tripod, what I may end up doing is having to choose a focus point off to the left or the right or the top or the bottom. So to make sure that Amy's eye stays in focus, I would then compose the shot where I would use a focus point over on another side or top or bottom. Does that make sense? So this is all part of it. Here's another, it goes to the unconscious competence. As you approach a scene, most experienced photographers are already figuring out what they need. In fact, Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was a very famous street photographer, French street photographer, was renowned for having his Leica, I can never pronounce it properly, he'd have it in his pocket, and he'd be looking at the scene, and he'd be adjusting the settings while the camera was still in his pocket, so that when he was ready for it, he called it the decisive moment, up, shoot, camera down. So all photographers, as they become more experienced, start to look at a scene as they're walking up to it and are already making decisions. When you're a newbie, of course, what you're doing is you're walking up going, okay, yeah. Oh, okay. And it's just the lack of experience. You'll also find, I'm just thinking of another kind of a funny one as well. Another one is most experienced photographers try to limit. Like, we talk about the distractions available, and we complain about the millennials and their phones and all that. Yeah. What's the first thing you do when you take a photo with a digital camera? You chimp. You ever heard that expression? Let me give you a visual. Ooh, 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 ooh. So it's called chimping. And it only ever happens with digital, never happened with film, because you can't really chimp 2 weeks later when the prints come back. So there's a distraction. So here's the problem. There's your subject. Robin's my subject. We're having a conversation in our head, and Robin's going, hello, I'm here. So really what we're trying to do is and this really, I suppose, what this course is about, is to try to give you an idea of what are the kind of general ballpark settings you'd be considering as you would go towards a particular scene. Going to go to the computer, Mike. Thank you. So essentially, with the camera wanting to focus on the biggest nearest thing, what we have is a situation where the camera will focus on the biggest nearest thing. If we try to compose using rule of thirds, which I'll talk about, then the camera will still try to refocus on that. So I've got to get it down to one single focus point, usually the center one, and certainly up to very recently, that was the most sensitive, the quickest to focus of all the focus points. It's called crosshair. They're beginning to make those in the exterior ones as well. So it all depends on your particular camera. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But definitely the center one is nice and sensitive.